For over 250 years, artists have been drawn to Snowdonia in search of inspiration. Most, though not all of them, came from across the border. They were effectively Wales's first tourists.
Today there are more convenient and more immediate ways of capturing the landscape. But do they convey the essence of our surroundings, the spirit of a place, as well as a painting can? I don't think so.
As someone who works in museums and galleries, I'm more used to seeing landscapes hanging on a wall. But there's nothing quite like the thrill of the real outdoors.
I've walked in a lot of places, including the Alps and the Himalayas, and I might be biased, but for its combination of beauty, history, and magical atmosphere, nowhere beats Snowdonia.
I'm going to visit some key locations here in North Wales. I'll be looking at the artists who came here and the paintings they were inspired to make.
And through these works, I'll be exploring our changing relationship with this awe-inspiring landscape.
My journey begins not in Snowdonia, but in the National Museum of Wales in Cardiff, with the work of one of the pioneers of Welsh landscape painting.
This is Richard Wilson, one of the founding members of the Royal Academy of Arts and its first professor of landscape. He was born in Penegoes in Montgomeryshire, but trained in London as a portrait painter before heading to Italy and establishing a very busy studio in Rome. That's where this portrait was painted when Wilson was 39 years old and enjoying great success.
During the 7 years that he spent in Italy, Wilson's paintings were greatly influenced by the works of past masters, such as the 17th century French painter Claude Lorraine. Claude's work was hugely popular at the time, and his perfectly balanced compositions, as we see here, had an enormous impact on Wilson.
He was interested in the way Claude arranged his compositions, a bit like a stage set, with trees on either side, framing a distant view. The aim wasn't to record the actual landscape in front of his eyes, but to take these key elements and arrange them into a pleasing and harmonious composition. But for a Snowdonia landscape, maybe something is lacking here. Some sheep.
When Wilson returned to Britain, he applied the principles of Claude's paintings to the landscapes of Wales. Just as Claude conjured up an ideal, classically inspired world, so Wilson drew on Wales's own ancient past. This painting of Dolbadan Castle shows the French master's influence and is only loosely based on the actual scene. The village by the castle looks more Italian than Welsh, and the castle itself is actually set much further back from the shore of the lake. But by setting it high on this promontory, Wilson created a much more dramatic effect.
In this painting, Snowdon from Llyn Nantlle, Wilson gives us a much truer representation of the actual scene, although he's lowered this ridge to show more of the flank of Snowdon behind. Wilson particularly admired the way Claude captured space and depth in his paintings. He once said, "You can take a walk in Claude's paintings and count the miles." And in this work, he matched, if not surpassed, his artistic hero, using light to lead the eye back to the distant peak of Snowdon.
In Wilson's day, there was great debate in artistic circles about the way nature should be appreciated, and various new ideas, like the picturesque, the beautiful, and the sublime, emerged.
We know exactly what the picturesque is. It's what it says on the tin. It's going round, looking at the landscape, trying to find views which reflect an idea of what an ideal landscape should look like. That's quite easy to define. The other main movements, the idea of the beautiful and the sublime, this sort of more romantic idea which you get later on when people get into the mountains and experience intense emotional excitement at the great precipices and cataracts and so on and so forth. You know, when Wilson paints Cadair Idris Llyn-y-Cai, that doesn't look like what Wilson's supposed to be painting. It doesn't look like the formal Claudian landscape adapted into Wales. It looks completely different. It disobeys all the rules. It's to do with allowing yourself to be overwhelmed by the magnificence of this landscape, mountains and so forth. There's a kind of an intensity in their feelings. To me, the difference between the picturesque and the ideas of the beautiful and the sublime, especially the sublime, is a difference of temperament, really.
The quest for rugged and uncultivated scenery, so admired by supporters of the sublime, continued apace.
One of the greatest exponents of the sublime in British painting was JMW Turner, and it was here in Wales that he honed his skills as a landscape artist.
Between 1792 and 1799, Turner visited Wales 5 times. He was just 17 when he first came, and 23 when he first visited Snowdonia. His trips lasted weeks, with Turner travelling on foot and on horseback. He was driven by a thirst for ever more challenging subjects, and coming from London, Snowdonia offered wilder and more rugged mountain scenery than anything he'd ever seen before. In this watercolour Nant Peris looking towards Snowdon, Turner captures a sense of the sublime as a burst of sunlight streams through the stormy clouds that hang above the mountain. The sun is the focus of the painting, as it often was in Turner's work. Light and its ever-changing effects on the landscape were the driving force of Turner's art throughout his career. On his deathbed, his last words, reputedly, were, "The sun is God."
In order to capture the effects of light, Turner had to work swiftly, filling many sketchbooks during his trips with pencil and watercolour studies. Back in his London studio then, he'd work these up into large-scale oil paintings. Using oil paints out of doors at the time wasn't practical, because oils had to be transported in pigs' bladders, and once punctured, these couldn't be resealed. The metal paint tubes that are so familiar today weren't invented till much later.
At this time, it's really Turner and also his friend and fellow artist, Thomas Girton, that are really leading this advancement in the use of watercolour painting. One of the best examples that we have at the National Museum of Wales is called A Grand View of Snowdon. It was hung in the Royal Academy in 1799, and this was really artists working in the colour, showing that you could use watercolour and have the same dramatic, instant effect that you could get in oil paintings.
Turner relished everything about these trips, even the bad weather. When he got back from Wales one year, he told a friend that he'd had much rain, but that made for better effects, like the changing appearance of the mountains under the passing clouds and the intermittent glimpses of the sun. On the one clear day that he'd had, he said that Snowdon appeared green and unpicturesque.
There's a lovely work that we have by Rowlandson, you may know it, of an artist travelling in Wales, where it shows an artist setting out on a tour, and he's laden down with all his equipment round him, and the weather is terrible, and there's even water dripping off the end of his nose. So it was hard to get around, to view these wonderful scenes.
Just as Snowdonia's most popular views are made into postcards today, in the same way, many 18th and 19th century landscape paintings were made into prints. As a result, the places they depicted became even better known, and more visitors went there, among them artists.
Cambria Depicta, a form of early travel book, was born from the need for a guide that would introduce tourists, but also artists, to less familiar scenes. Unable to speak Welsh, they couldn't ask for directions, and so rarely ventured off the beaten track. The publisher John Boydell thought the solution was for a native, a Welsh speaker with local knowledge, to help uncover these lesser-known vistas. Edward Pugh was that man. In 1815, a year before the publication of Pugh's book, Thomas Telford had built the impressive Waterloo Bridge at Betws-y-Coed, which made the village an important coaching centre along the Irish mail route to Holyhead. This brought new traffic to the village, and Betws-y-Coed became a magnet for artists. From the 1840s onwards, artists from all over Europe flocked to the village each summer. The parlour of this hotel, the Royal Oak, was like an artist's club, and according to one of the painters who frequented the place, the atmosphere was very cosmopolitan. I have heard French, German, Hungarian, English and Welsh flowing on like a polyglot stream at the same time in that dingy parlour. Sitting at the centre of the group, with his pint of ale and a cigar, would be the artist David Cox. Cox, seen here near the end of his life, was from Birmingham and one of the first painters to discover the artistic potential of Betws-y-Coed. He specialised in watercolours for most of his career, but in his 50s he took up oil painting. David Cox was something of a father figure for the younger artists in Betws-y-Coed, willing to teach and willing to listen, and he passed on to them his love of the area. One of his contemporaries said, what Walter Scott did for the Highlands and Wordsworth for the Lake District, David Cox has done for Wales. That might be something of an exaggeration, but it does show the importance of Wales as a subject of his art. Cox was drawn not only to the landscape, but also to the way of life and the customs of the local people. Whenever he stayed in Betws, he attended this church, and when a young girl related to the Royal Oak's landlord died, he painted a picture of her funeral procession, wending its way towards the graveyard. Cox didn't often make use of symbolism, but here, the setting sun and the small children gathering poppies both evoke death.
The thing about Cox, certainly from when he takes up residence in Betws in 1844 during the summer, is that he's a lot older than the other artists around him. Cox is a great teacher. He's known to be a great teacher. He's a very agreeable man. He's a gentle man, a man of strong Christian convictions, a churchman, very popular with local people in Betws. He becomes a kind of a bit of an institution, really, in Betws. And that group of painters expands quite rapidly, and what happens is that instead of visiting, some of these painters take up residence.
One of the most celebrated artists who settled here was Clarence Whaite from Manchester. And like Cox, he drew and painted directly from nature.
He becomes intimately familiar both with the landscape in its broadest sense, painting sometimes very large mystical pictures which are to do with his attitude to God in nature. He's a devout Christian. He sees in that landscape God's handiwork. He's very concerned with ideas about the turning of the seasons, regeneration, rebirth, quite deep, profound philosophical questions. He's also a modernist. For instance, in his most famous painting, The Rainbow, which is an enormous picture, which he spends 2 years painting actually in the landscape. And it's constructed entirely of tiny dots of colour, tiny, tiny, tiny dots of contrasting colour, because he's very interested in scientific developments about the nature of colour, about colour theory. It's basically a pointillist painting. Well, pointillism is something which is going to become very big news in France 25 years later with Seurat and Signac. Clarence Whaite is doing it in this enormous picture in 1862. It's quite extraordinary, so it's very radical.
Nearly 20 years after he painted the rainbow, Whaite was instrumental in helping to establish a legacy for the Betws-y-Coed Colony of artists, a legacy that has lasted to this day. The Royal Cambrian Academy of Art is the longest established artist-led organisation in Wales. And it's not in Cardiff, as you might expect, but here in Conwy, the gateway to Snowdonia. The local landowner, Lord Mostyn, offered them the lease of his neglected Elizabethan mansion, Plas Mawr, but the space didn't lend itself to exhibitions, so in 1895 they built an annex, and the Royal Cambrian Academy have had a gallery on this site ever since. With Whaite as one of its first presidents, the society developed into a national centre of excellence for both indigenous and incoming artists. Whaite was an intensely focused character, and even in his 80s would devote 2 years to painting one of his last works. Completed in 1911, Snowdon is a reflective, mystical painting in which the ageing artist seems to be meditating on what lies ahead. That same year, a much younger artist, 22-year-old John Dixon Innes, was breaking new ground 30 miles to the south near Bala. Innes was born in Llanelli and had studied at the Slate School of Fine Art in London, but he was unsettled and looking for a new creative challenge.
In 1910, fresh out of art school, Innes came to North Wales in search of artistic inspiration. Despite suffering from tuberculosis, he was defiantly neglectful of his health and had been wandering these remote moors in Meirionydd, sleeping out in the open. One evening, he was taken in by an innkeeper near here, and waking up the next morning, he was struck by the imposing view of Arenig Fawr rising up against the sky. He had found his inspiration.
Between 1911 and 1913, Innes painted the Arenig Mountains time and time again. His vibrant colours show the influence of the Fauvist artists Matisse and Derain, whose works he got to know during his visits to the south of France. Along with his fellow Welshman Augustus John and the Australian artist Derwent Lees, Innes established an artistic retreat at Nantddu, 10 miles west of Bala. But his paintings from this period weren't all landscapes. Like John, he was fascinated by the local gypsy community. He emulated their free, nomadic lifestyle and also made them the subject of his art, as in this picture, Girl Standing by a Lake.
And here I am, a 21st century girl standing by a lake. This is more or less exactly the spot where Innes painted his picture. He lived in a little house just over there, but I think the day he was painting might have been a little less windy and a little warmer than it is today.
According to Augustus John, Innes was never happier than when painting in this district, perceived by him as the reflection of some miraculous promised land. Sadly, Innes died of tuberculosis in 1914, when he was just 27 years old. For Innes, the mountain was a place of solace, almost sacred. But other mountains in northwest Wales were seen as a source of profit.
We don't usually associate Snowdonia with industry, but from the 18th century onwards, this area experienced its own industrial revolution, as entrepreneurs burrowed into these mountains in search of copper, lead, granite, and of course, slate.
This was once the biggest quarry in the world. It's not conventionally beautiful and not an obvious subject for painting, perhaps, but artists have been drawn to this place for nearly 200 years. One of the first was Henry Hawkins, with his painting of Penrhyn Quarry in 1832. It shows an army of industrious workers swarming everywhere. With the quarry's sheer rock faces towering above these minuscule figures, the artist has applied some of the principles of the sublime landscape to an industrial environment. At the time, the quarry was regarded as a man-made wonder of nature and became something of a tourist attraction. We know that the future Queen Victoria visited in 1832 when she was 13, and that may well be why this picture was painted. In the corner is a well-dressed visitor, possibly the artist himself. By the time the artist Peter Prendergast came to the same area 140 years later, the slate industry was a shadow of its former self, but the quarry still retained its capacity to inspire painters.
I think the people that worked in this quarry behind you, they've dug it, they've carved it, they've looked after it. What is a greater monument than that quarry? What piece of sculpture would be greater than that?
Penrhyn Quarry became one of the big subjects of his life. His work was very expressionist, and some people call it cubist. He used a lot of black to surround the blocks of colour that he used to show the slate outcrops. He saw the way the sunlight hit the slate, the reflections in the rain. He saw blues, he saw yellows, he saw orange. He saw the quarries in a way that the average person wouldn't see, and brought them alive in a way that an artist could.
As well as painting the quarry, Prendergast was also interested in the surrounding countryside and applied the same geometric patterns to these fields.
He was unusual that he didn't feature people in his landscape. I can't recall a picture that shows a person, although there were people about. It wasn't what he was interested in, it was the form of the land and man's effect on the landscape that interested him and what drove him to paint.
Peter Prendergast died in 2007, and his work brings us almost up to the present day. However, there's one landscape giant of the last 50 years whom we've yet to mention. John Caffin Williams, affectionately known simply as Caffin, was born on Anglesey, and though he spent much of his life teaching in London, he returned to Wales in his later years and lived in a small cottage on the Menai Straits.
It's a great place for looking over to the mountains, because from here I'm able to look right across and see exactly what weather it is. If it's a day for painting, I'm up in the mountains in half an hour.
Caffin was a very quick painter. In the morning he'd go out of his house and look at where the wind was blowing, where the light was coming from, and choose where he'd go to paint that day. He quite often strapped 2-3 canvases to his back, take a haversack of paints and a palette and go up the mountains and come back at the end of the day with 3 paintings. He's a very prolific artist, and he's perhaps the most well-known artist in Wales.
It was the mountains in wind and rain, the sun bursting through the cloud and shining on the slopes. All these memories somehow formed a sort of library in my mind, and that was an immense importance to me as a landscape painter.
During his lifetime, Caffin generously donated many works to galleries and institutions around Wales. Here at Bangor University, there are 9 works by him, some in quite unexpected locations.
He initially painted with a brush and then became more familiar with using a palette knife, which gave him the texture, and his work was very vigorous.
Caffin was interested in capturing the texture and character of Snowdonia, and did so with a limited palette of colours and very muted, earthy tones. These he laid down thickly with his palette knife in his robust hallmark style, which really captures the essence and the rugged terrain of this mountainous region.
I think it's terribly important for a painter to think and have time to feel. Art must come from, I think, from peace and contemplation, if it's going to last.
One thing that certainly seems set to last is Snowdonia's continuing appeal for contemporary artists. Alison Bradley is the latest in a long line of painters who've been drawn to Betws-y-Coed from across the border.
Were you aware of this artistic heritage when you arrived here, and do you see yourself as continuing in the footsteps of these earlier artists?
I knew a little bit when I opened the gallery, but I've discovered much more, and it's really wonderful to go out and visit the locations that artists painted in the past, but I'm doing it in my own style. I like to go out and make sketches and be in a location and get the feeling for it, and then that information, the rough paintings and sometimes photographs, develop it into a larger picture in the studio.
There's long been a demand for views of Snowdonia. Who comes in to buy your paintings?
Oh, I have visitors from all over the world, especially in the summer months in Betws-y-Coed, but I also have day trippers from Manchester and Liverpool, and local people as well who love the landscape. So there is a huge demand, and people are still looking for landscape work. And it's just the drama and the beauty of them. People want to get back home and have a little part of that to take with them.
Elfyn Lewis's work is very different from that of Alison Bradley, and yet they both draw their inspiration from the same area. Whilst Alison has settled in North Wales, Elfyn has lived in Cardiff for 20 years, but still thinks of Porthmadog on the edge of Snowdonia as his home.
How important is the landscape of the area in your work?
Oh, it's vitally important, you know. It's never left me, really. I kind of, you know, I'm there every 3-4 weeks, you know. I go home, and I need to go home to just feel and to be in it. You know, I go running or walking. It creates something within me that I have to then go back down a Cardiff and try and capture it in a kind of abstract way, I suppose.
What about your sort of method of painting? This sort of seems to suggest something of the weather and the climate. Is that
yeah, I think so. Well, hopefully, you know, hopefully. It's just, you know, I kind of work in a kind of printmaking process where I'm kind of building these layers up and then trying to kind of pull something out that kind of, maybe a bit like archaeology, trying to dig something out that you can recognise or think that you recognise. But I don't know, it's nice that the viewer, like yourself, looks at it and thinks, oh, maybe that is this or that, you know, so I want them to get lost in it, the same as when you go into a landscape itself, you know, that it takes you away from your day-to-day and, I don't know, transports you to somewhere. And I suppose with me living here in Cardiff, I'm trying to transport myself back to maybe to Porthmadog and the area.
How will Snowdonia be portrayed in 50 years' time? What will be hanging in these galleries then? And will it even be hanging? Or will these spaces be given over to video art and installation? Whatever the answer, I suspect the demand for landscape painting will be as strong as ever.
And the landscape of Snowdonia will continue to inspire painters, as it has done for the last 250 years.
Well, stay with us next on BBC Two Wales. Super furry frontman Griff Rhys on the trail of a Welsh explorer from 1792 in the American interior.